Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 7th class on Song of the Lark. I have a few things that I would like to bring to your attention. Again, back to those remarkable chapters regarding Tea's transformation in Colorado. There's so much material on it because the transformation is so significant, and yet it isn't something that occurs quickly. It's something that she gradually experiences. So, in an article entitled, I don't know what it's entitled. No, it's in this book about critical essays on Willa Cather. This is by Richard G. Unknown. He's at the University of Nebraska, and he observes that the 4th, 5th, and 6th parts of Song of the Lark treat the liberation of Tea's treasure of creative powers. Willa Cather does not delineate a rapid ascent to achievement from the desire of childhood and the direction of youth. Between consecration and action, there falls a great quiet pause for reflection. In Willa Cather's view of artistic growth, the reposeful lull is a crucial moment. It is particularly restorative for Thea Kronberg. The pause is the retreat before the great advance, a return to the origin of all creativity, the earth. Thea's experience in the spacious, powerful canyons of the Southwest incorporates the early excitement of childhood among the open sandhills, and intellectually it goes back further to the nature of history. Contact with the earth removes data from history to leave only the basic thing, man's continuous fight to achieve something beyond himself. We saw that in the ancient people's pottery. That fight holds value, and it repeats itself and in everyone at every stage of human development. The contest is the basis and embodiment of art. Thea achieves this understanding among rocks, air, birds, and sky, the first things which tested man's power to control and shape. And we see Thea appreciating the ancient peoples, especially when she's in one of the little cliff dwellers' homes which they had dug out. Transformation is brought about in Panther Canyon in Arizona, where she lives alongside relics of the cliff dweller civilization. She is able to divine the daily tone of the cliff dweller life, and this empathy helps her to shed the Chicago bitterness and to enjoy immersion in the earliest spheres of gladness. So she is experiencing this from the history that is left behind by these peoples. Even in extinction, ancient Indian life testifies to taste and aspiration. Its art suggests a unity between utensil and spiritual need. Especially beautiful to Thea are the jars which hold the precious water. The vessels are functional but also expressive and consecrated to the water they house. Their pottery was their most direct appeal to water, the envelope and sheath of the precious element itself. The cliff dwellers transformed nature but still lived according to it. Elevation was a way of life, the vistas a way of seeing and regarding life widely and freely. They civilized themselves. That is the ultimate heroism for Willa Cather. The severe and mighty geography dignifies, it does not falsify, the hardness of human labor. So there's something very intense about Thea's return, Thea's existence in the cliff dwellers' homes. Oh, here it is. Did you see me looking around for the book? So there's some additional notes. This is in Hermione Lee. And in this, she says the landscape itself, the pine forests of northern Arizona with their lonely trees, places of reserve, the deep fissures of the canyons cutting down through the flat tableland, the blue air of the gulfs between the two sides of the canyons, full of swallows, the trees and streams right down in the gorge between the cliffs. All this strikes Taya with a sense of alien resistance to human beings. Remember that concept. I mentioned this last week, that nature is neither benevolent towards man nor malevolent. It just is there. And man is expected to understand it and immerse himself in it, him or herself. All Cather's characters have this emotion. The bishop riding through the Mesa country, the 17th century French apothecary on the Grey Rock in the Canadian wilderness for great undomesticated landscapes. In the cold early morning, the canyon wakes like an old man with a dull, malignant mind. That people have succeeded in domesticating such a place by building their homes into the shape of the cliffs is felt like the more recent struggles of the pioneers as an almost incredible human victory over the inimical matter. So the Indian relics give off a sense of tribulation and melancholy. The simple, insistent, and monotonous feelings Taya recognizes in the place are all to do with survival. These feelings translate themselves to Taya not as words, but as bodily sensations. Remember when she was laying on the flat area where the sun comes and warms the stone where she's living. She's not really living, but she does go to these homes of the ancient peoples. Cather, in turn, translating into words which will be as close as possible to those sensations, uses a language which negotiates very deliberately between male and female struggles and efforts. Ellen Moores and Sharon O'Brien, two additional critics, call Panther Canyon the most thoroughly elaborated female landscape in literature, with its fissures, its womb-like nest and cave where Taya spends her days. It is concealed, cleft in the heart of the world, from which she watches the flight of the eagle. The relics of the ancient people's culture to which she responds, the fragments of the decorated pots once used by the women for water carrying, are, as O'Brien says, the work of women artists whose art was profoundly female, integrating procreative and creative powers, which is embodied in Taya herself. She understands that they're water vessels, functional molds for catching the stream of life, water, essential shapes made for survival, but decorated for pleasure, can be symbols for her of what her own voice can do. Like them, she can make shapes in which to catch life. But by implication, the process is a negation of and a triumph over that grudging, malevolent spirit of the forbidding landscape. As I said, though, it's really less malevolent than just something that exists, which Taya imagined living in her cliff-dwelling cave. So I just thought that the amount of material written about that book is just so enlightening in that section. One other thing, we are now going to go to New York with Taya. I'm pretty sure that we stopped on page 317, which is the beginning of Dr. Archie's venture. And I just have one small quick note about New York. This is from that article that I've been reading from about the places in the novel. Of course, New York is there. It's the artistic center of American culture at the time. And this is the place to which Archie comes and agrees to provide money for Taya to go abroad to Germany and study with the best teachers in order to become a successful operatic artist. So here we are in New York. But first, if we turn to the text, the first chapter on page 317 begins with Dr. Archie. He had come to Denver for a meeting of the stockholders in the San Felipe silver mine. Oh, from my notes, I didn't know this part. Denver was founded in 1859 at Cherry Creek, the site of the first Colorado gold find a year before. Later, silver-bearing lead carbonate was found at Leadville and Creede, attracting more miners and financiers, and Colorado became known as the Silver State. The San Felipe mine is fictional. However, remember that before we left Dr. Archie, before Taya left Moonstone, Dr. Archie had been talking about some big venture that he might embark on. But he was, as we all know, held back very much by his wife, his stingy wife. And you know what? Before we go to New York, I forgot to show you something. I forgot to show you this last week, but my co-teacher in the jail went to Colorado 25 years ago. And one of the books that she bought was how when you go to national parks, there's frequently books and stories about it. Well, she bought this book. And what I thought was very interesting is some of the pictures, one of which is this one. See this? I was struck by this because that is a woman climbing the cliffs in a dress. And this is what I picture Taya doing. She climbs these things all the time, up and down the canyon. And then when she is joined later on out in the desert, let's see, we got a bad reflection here. This was one of the pictures that was included in the book, but to me, this looks like Taya and maybe Ray out in the desert, and later Fred. Isn't that interesting? Sitting there in a dress. I guess I didn't really, I don't know that I pictured her in a dress. I sure didn't picture her in blue jeans, but I just thought that these pictures brought that to light. There she is out there in the desert, and here is a nice picture of the Lonely Pines. Isn't that interesting? And so you can visualize these things because Cather explained them in such clear detail. I have to bring that book back to my friend. So anyway, let's go to Dr. Archie, and he apparently, and this is not explained yet, he has apparently become successful in a silver mine. Remember that the wife was holding him back. We don't know anything yet, though. And I underlined this one line here. One of those beautiful storms that wrapped Denver in dry, furry snow. When I read that, there was furry snow everywhere. Now, of course, it's mostly melted. But I just thought that was a really good detail. If we go to the next page, page 318, we have Taya's letter to Dr. Archie. And she hasn't written very much, and she says, I could not write you frankly, and so I would not write at all. Heather drops a lot of little bits of information, and one of which is that Taya is very clear spoken, and she's not going to beat around the bush, nor is she going to lie about her circumstances. But we know things, if you've read this far, we know things are going to decline. At the bottom of this page, here's a bit about insight about her handwriting. This is in a bold, jagged handwriting with a Gothic turn to the letters, something between a highly sophisticated hand and a very unsophisticated one, not in the least smooth or flowing. And I think that's Taya. She is not in the least smooth or flowing. It fits and starts, and she's pushing against the walls that have held her back. Over on page 319, Dr. Archie has received this letter, and quite quickly he determines that he is going to go to New York. He's waiting for someone named Captain Harris. And it says over on 319 towards the bottom of the page, he was one of the grand old bluffers of those good old days. I was not sure what that meant, but if you Google bluffer, it's a trickster, or maybe somebody who's put on, he's got his Stetson here and fierce mustaches. We think maybe that this guy has taken on some qualities now that he's out in the West. And I also have a note about the bottom of this paragraph. As gullible as a schoolboy, he had managed with his sharp eye and knowing air and twisted blonde mustaches to pass him off for an astute financier, and the Denver papers respectfully referred to him as the Rothschild of Cripple Creek. And I have a note on this. Colorado's richest gold field was discovered at Cripple Creek in 1891. The Rothschilds, a famous family of German financiers, controlled much of the wealth of Western Europe for almost a century. So he's, but we know he's a bluffer. We know that he's not quite on the up and up. He's made himself into something perhaps more than he actually is. But they talk about the shares that they have in the San Felipe mine, and Dr. Archie says that he needs to cash out some of those. And then they do a little business deal here. I'll lend you the money. Don't take it out of the mine. Down at the bottom of page 320, the captain took out his checkbook and a book of blank notes and adjusted his nose nippers. I didn't know what nose nippers were. They're those little glasses that don't have arms on them, and they just pinch onto your nose. Of course, that's a nose nipper. Then over on page 320, there's a bit of insight into why Dr. Archie decides to go. He's going to rescue her because he has, or she has asked for his help. And he says over on 321, in the middle of the page, when he at last issued out into the storm, it was with a feeling of elation rather than of anxiety. Whatever was wrong, he could make it right. Her letter had practically said so. So he's going to go and help her. They always had this very nice, intense relationship. Down at the bottom of page 321. However, he thought as he walked up towards the club, he was on the whole glad that his first trip had a human interest and that he was going for something because he was wanted. Well, who doesn't want to be wanted? And he says a few lines later, and when it's Taya, oh, I back her. She just seems to have that kind of strength in her friendships. If we look at page 322, he has gone to the tailor to get better looking clothes so he doesn't look so out west. He's at the tailor's. He kept whistling, "Flow gently, sweet Afton." That is a reference to a song by Robert Burns to an old Scottish air. It's a tribute to Burns's early patroness who lived on the Afton. So he's singing this song. The let's see. If you the haberdasher says you must have a date there, doctor. You behave like a bridegroom, and made him remember that he wasn't one. Isn't that interesting? Because never has Dr. Archie ever indicated any kind of love interest in Taya, and yet we're getting little crumbs of information about his feelings towards her. In much the same way that Ray had intended to marry her. Last line of this chapter, before he let him go, Van, the tailor, put his finger on the Masonic pin in his client's lapel. And he says, mustn't wear that, doctor. Very bad form back there. I have a note on that says the Masonic pin is from the Masons, the International Secret Fraternity Order of Freemasons, had its origins in medieval English and Scottish fraternities of stonemasons and cathedral builders. The order is founded on principles that are traditionally liberal and democratic: religious toleration, loyalty to local government, and political compromise. And the American founding fathers and a great many presidents and congressmen have been Masons. Excuse me. After Masons were charged with an 1826 murder in New York, however, the anti-Masonic Party was organized to prevent members of the order from being elected to public office, and its influence spread to other eastern states. Thus, while both Dr. Archie's Scottish ancestry and his political ambitions made it advantageous to be a Mason in Colorado, it is doubtful that it would have been true in New York. Little insight into that. So the fact that he's wearing this Masonic pin suggests something too. Again, another little hint that Cather is dropping for us. In a few pages, someone's going to suggest that Dr. Archie run for office. Page 322, we return to Fred. His attitude was one of deep dejection, and his face, though it had the cool, unimpeachable fairness possible only to a very blond young man, was no means happy. So far in the text, we have not learned what has happened between Taya and Fred. But I just marked this at the top of page 323. There's some really beautiful description. She asked Ottenberg to come in and pointed to one of the clumsy, sullen-looking chairs. Isn't that fabulous? A sullen-looking chair. If you go into any consignment shops, there's always a sullen-looking chair off in the corner, holding some other kind of trinket. That were as thick as they were high. The room was brown with time, dark in spite of two windows that opened on Union Square, with dull curtains and carpet, and heavy, respectable-looking furniture in somber colors. The place was saved from utter dismalness by a coal fire under the black and marble mantelpiece, brilliantly reflected in a long mirror that hung between the two windows. So the room is somber. The furniture is somber. The room is somber. And Fred has now entered this room. This is where Taya is, down about 2/3 of the way from the bottom. Of course, I wanted him. I would never have asked such a thing of him if I hadn't wanted him a great deal. It's a very expensive trip for him, Taya spoke severely. Then she went on in a milder tone. He doesn't say anything about the money, but I think his coming means that he can let me have it. So, we know that Ottenberg has a lot of money, but she clearly does not seem to want to take it from him. At the bottom of the page, that's explained. I don't see why you won't borrow from me and let him sign with you, for instance. That would constitute a perfectly regular business transaction. We just saw a perfectly regular business transaction between Dr. Archie and Captain Harris. Clearly put there for us to see that that is a regular business transaction. He said, I could bring suit against either of you for my money. So he's saying you should be just borrowing it from me. But at the top of 324, in a way I shall feel freer on Dr. Archie's, and in another way I shall feel more bound. I shall try even harder. He is almost like my father. Towards the bottom of 324, I'm afraid, Taya went on gravely, that he won't understand. He'll be hard on you. So, again, we haven't gotten the straightforward explanation for what has happened. But if you recall, Ottenberg is married. It's a pretty dreadful turn of events. Down at the bottom of 324, Fred studied the white ash of his cigarette before he flicked it off. You mean he'll see me as even worse than I am? Yes, I suppose I shall look very low to him, a fifth-rate scoundrel, because he kept his marriage from Taya. Taya said, we'll both look pretty low, and after all, we must really be just about as we shall look to him. And this conversation is pretty cryptic, but by reading, so to speak, between the lines, we can tell that in that line she says that they're both going to look bad. Well, why would that be? Because she went off to Mexico with him. And remember, over and over, when Taya was still in Moonstone, the family was very conscious of what the neighbors would say. And you can bet that at that time, a young woman who has gone off with a young man to Mexico doesn't look so good. At the top of page 325, from your cradle, as I once told you, you've been doing it on the side, living your own life, admitting to yourself things that would horrify him. You've always deceived him to the extent of letting him think you different from what you are. He couldn't understand then. He couldn't understand now. So why not spare yourself and him? This is one of those paragraphs that should be starred, because she admits that she has not maybe revealed everything about the it in her, the artist in her. She goes on, of course, I had my own thoughts. Maybe he has had his, too, but I've never done anything before that he would much mind. I must put myself right with him, as right as I can, to begin over. He'll make allowances for me. He always has, but I'm afraid he won't for you. So, she thinks Dr. Archie's going to look rather askance at Ottenberg. Next paragraph. At the worst, he spoke wonderingly, I thought you'd perhaps let me go in on the business end of it and invest along with you. You'd put in your talent and ambition and hard work, and I'd put in the money. And then he adds at the end of this paragraph, your doctor friend hasn't cared half so much about your future as I have. He's really trying to convince her to borrow the money from him. And she needs a lot of money because she wants to go to Germany to learn with the best. She says, I'd have liked your helping me 8 months ago, but now you'd simply be keeping me. That's what she's trying to avoid. She doesn't want to be a kept woman because he can't marry her. Of course, we see Cather's mind working here. And we know from some of the criticism that I've talked about, this is the development of the artist. And when we get to the end of the novel, we're going to find that the only way an artist can truly transform him or herself is to forego everything else, as Cather seems to have done fairly often. At the top of this page, 326. Since then, you've come into your personality. You were always locking horns with it before. You were a sullen little drudge 8 months ago. So we know a couple of things from this. 8 months ago, she was still battling with herself to try and develop, to free herself, to free the it. But we also know that they've been together for 8 months. And then a few lines later, a voice is personality. It can be as big as a circus and as common as dirt. There's good money in that kind too, but I don't happen to be interested in them. Nobody could tell much about what you might be able to do last winter. I saw more than anyone else. And maybe that's true. He did think that he saw something in her, and he has told her, he told her that, she didn't reveal the it to Dr. Archie, but she revealed it to Fred. But like with Ray, who would have married her, and she would have remained in Moonstone, being a piano teacher, he freed her by willing her enough money to get to Chicago. But he's got out of the way. And the same thing is happening here to Fred. She might have attached herself to him, but he's married. So he too has to be gotten out of the way. Towards the bottom of page 326, how can you turn on me so, after all? He sighed. I haven't, she says, but when you arranged with yourself to take me in like that, you couldn't have been thinking very kindly of me. So she's kind of worried about her reputation, I suppose. Page 327, in that first complete paragraph, I think is a really interesting insight into the position of women at the time. We know this because we've seen this in many, many short stories and in other novels. A lot of girls go to boarding school together, come out the same season, dance at the same parties, are married off in groups, have their babies at about the same time, send their children to school together, and so the human crop renews itself. Isn't that a good analogy? Such women know as much about the reality of the forms they go through as they know about the wars they learned the dates of. They get their most personal experiences out of novels and plays. Everything is secondhand with them. Why, you couldn't live like that. So that is the position of women at the time. That's exactly what happened. But most of them were satisfied with it. Thea was not. Down at the bottom, we get some of Fred's view of her. Say what you will, Thea Kronberg. You are not that sort of person. You will never sit alone with a pacifier and a novel. You won't subsist on what the old ladies have put into the bottle for you. You will always break through into the realities. That was the first thing Harsanyi found out about you, that you couldn't be kept on the outside. If you've lived in Moonstone all your life and got with your discreet brakeman, you have had just the same nature. Isn't that interesting? So he had to be gotten out of the way. At the top of page 328, your children would have been the realities then, probably. If they'd been commonplace, you would have killed them with driving. Not killed them in a driving vehicle, killed with her momentum, the drive that she feels, she would have driven onto them. You'd have managed in some way to live 20 times as much as the people around you. So he's giving us what we already know about Thea, but he has this insight into her as well. In the middle, page 328, then why in heaven's name won't you let me be your friend? You make a scoundrel of me, borrowing money from another man to get out of my clutches. Yeah, that's what she's trying to do. She doesn't want to be kept by him. She has to be free to do this on her own. If I borrow from him, it's to study. Anything I took from you would be different. As I said before, you'd be keeping me. Yeah, that's probably true. At the bottom of 328, the name, as you call it, makes a difference to me, how I feel about myself. You would have acted very differently with a girl of your own kind, and that's why I can't take anything from you now. Being married is one thing, and not being married is the other thing, and that's all there is to it. You say I was too much alone, and yet what you did was to cut me off more than I ever had been. Yeah, he did. They went to Mexico. Um, One paragraph later, if you know me as well as you say you do, Fred, she said slowly, then you are not being honest with yourself. You know that I can't do things halfway. If you kept me at all, you'd keep me. If you kept me at all, you'd keep all of me, is what she's saying. Next paragraph, Fred leaned over her and said just above his breath, then when I get that divorce, you'll take it up with me again? You'll at least let me know, warn me, before there's a serious question of anybody else? That's why they've broken up. He can't marry her. She doesn't want to be a kept woman. And even if the description of the wife are not particularly flattering, in fact, they seem kind of a lot like Dr. Archie's wife, another really unflattering character. Without lifting her head, Taya answered him, I don't think there ever will be a question of anyone else. Not if I can help it. So that's what she's saying. She has given up Fred, and she probably loved him, but she probably won't have that ever with anyone. And it isn't just because Fred is a good match for her. It's because she's going to set herself free in order to be the artist. Let's see. Next chapter on page 330. Both windows were open, and the fire in the grate was low, for the day was one of those false springs that sometimes blow into New York from the sea in the middle of winter, soft, warm, with a persuasive salty moisture in the air and a relaxing thaw underfoot. That's like today, don't you think? If you look outside, you can see the reflection in my cabinet. But it's a really beautiful day, and while the grass is not entirely thawed, it is starting to get a little squishy. Cather calls it a false spring. Well, we have fall springs. I think it's supposed to snow tomorrow or Tuesday. But anyway, I just like, sometimes her phrasing is just so good. So he sends her flowers, and then if we look down at the bottom of page 331, Taya sat down on the edge of the sofa and began shutting and opening her hands nervously. Well, I told him enough, and not too much. This is what she's telling Fred that she told Dr. Archie. Wouldn't you just like to know that? Did she tell him that she went off to Mexico with a man? I told him all about how good you were to me last winter, getting me engagements and things, and how you had helped me with my work more than anybody. And I told him about how you sent me down to the ranch when I had no money or anything. She paused and wrinkled her forehead. And I told him that I wanted to marry you and ran away to Mexico with you, and that I was awfully happy until you told me that you couldn't marry me because... Oh. Well, I told him why. She lowered her eyes and moved the toe of her shoe about restlessly on the carpet. Oh. So Cather didn't really reveal this in a conversation in which, you could imagine somebody might cry. It's revealed later in retrospect. It's very effective. If you look over on the top of page 332, in that first paragraph. But when I told him that I absolutely knew you wanted to marry me, that you would whenever you could, that seemed to help him a good deal. So she felt as though she needed to explain the situation to Dr. Archie. And so she does. And next paragraph, you see he's just tremendously good and tremendously afraid of things, of some things. Otherwise, he would have got rid of Mrs. Archie. I think that meant just a divorce, but, in Moonstone, you couldn't get a divorce. She looked up suddenly. You were right, though. One can't tell people about things they don't know already. Next paragraph. Yes, you can, my dear, but you must tell it in such a way that they don't know you're telling it, and that they don't know they're hearing it. She smiled at him and said, I see. It's a secret, like the sound in the shell, like the it that she keeps here or in her heart. On page 333 in the middle of the page, you'll have to live up a little to his notion of us. Taya seemed to consider the suggestion favorably. If you wish him to be easy in his mind, Fred went on, that would help, I think. Myself, that we are rather nice together. So they do feel as if they need to explain themselves to Dr. Archie. I mean, things were what they were at the time. Let's see, second last paragraph on the page, she shook her head. No, he's none of that. He's very good, and he won't admit things. I love him for it. Now, as I look back on it, I see that I've always, even when I was little, shielded him. So we've seen Dr. Archie. We've seen him act vulnerable, and that's the insight she has into him, that he is a little afraid of things. So Fred leaves, and the last sentence on the page, then he blew her a kiss with his fingertips, and fled. I thought that was an interesting choice of word. Cather didn't say he walked out the door. She said he fled. There's connotation in that, as if trying to escape. He's got to get out of there. And if we go into the next chapter, page 334, the third paragraph, from the moment when the doctor lifted his glass and looked consciously at Taya, said, to your success. Fred liked him. He felt his quality, understood his courage in some directions, and what Taya called his timidity in others, his unspent and miraculously preserved youthfulness. And that's Dr. Archie. At the bottom of the page, Archie is conscious of the change in her. It was just this change which at present interested Fred more than anything else. That he felt was his created value, that it was his best chance for peace of mind. As though Fred has contributed to this growth in her. And we've seen that in all of the friendships that Taya has, that she gleans something from everyone in her life, and we see it become manifest later on. On page 335, that's exactly one of her advantages, Dr. Archie. Nobody can ever take that away from her, and none of us who came later can ever hope to rival Moonstone in the impression we make. Her score of values will always be the Moonstone scale, and with an artist, that is an advantage, because it's not the New York mentality. It's not the Chicago mentality. Remember the scene when she comes out of that opera, and she wants to keep the elation that she felt after hearing the music, but she gets jostled by the kind of the furiousness of the crowd. That's what is foreign to her. What she possesses is the Moonstone self. At the bottom of page 335, do you know, Mr. Ottenberg, he said deeply, these people all look happier to me than our Western people do. Is it simply good manners on their part, or do they get more out of life? And he's talking about New Yorkers. The top of the next page. Fred turned to him cheerfully. New York people live a good deal in the fourth dimension, Dr. Archie. It's that you notice, that's what you notice in their faces. And he explains what he means by the fourth dimension. I mean that life is not quite so personal here as it is in your part of the world. People are more taken up by hobbies, interests that are less subject to reverses than their personal affairs. And that's exactly probably what goes on in New York. You can be more anonymous in New York and even Chicago than you can be in a community where you are known by everybody, like in Moonstone. Let's see, at the bottom of page 336, but I should say on the spur of the moment that is one of the principal differences between people anywhere. It's the consolation of fellows like me who didn't accomplish much. The fourth dimension is not good for business, but we think we have a better time. So in other words, people without the artistic nature, which probably developed in her partly because she was from Moonstone. And while New Yorkers look like they have more fun, a better time, they don't have the it. They live superficially. Dr. Archie leaned back in his chair. His heavy shoulders were contemplative. And he said slowly, should you say that she is one of the kind you refer to? And a person in the fourth dimension. But we know that's not true. She is not one of those people. In fact, at the top of 337, he says, never, never. She is as hard-headed as the worst of you, with a difference. Yes, with a difference. They agree. So the doctor says that this is of her connection to Spanish Johnny. She was born a cosmopolitan, and because remember, she went off to the Mexican town, and I expect she learned a good deal from Johnny when she used to run away and go to Mexican town. We thought it a queer freak then, but the truth is that she is gleaning things from each one of her experiences. At the bottom of page 337, if he was shy, it was because her greater positiveness, her whole augmented self, made him feel that his accustomed manner toward her was inadequate. And some of the language in the preceding sentences, she's a little dazzling, she's very strong, she's overpoweringly so. And we know that we're witnessing some additional growth. At the top of page 338, she seemed to sit there on the edge, emerging from one world into another, taking her bearings, but with absolute self-confidence. So far from shrinking, she expanded. You have to underline that. So far from shrinking, she expanded. The mere kindly effort to please Dr. Archie was enough to bring her out. So the next chapter begins with Fred's mother's accident. What did she do? She fell down and broke her ankle, I think. Next, third paragraph at the bottom of page 338. All day, Taya was somewhat cast down. She was sorry for Fred, and she missed the feeling that she was the one person in his mind. He had scarcely looked at her. She felt as if she were set aside, and she did not seem important even to herself as she had yesterday, because suddenly Fred's attention has shifted to his mother and her accident. I forget what happened to her. She fell, I think. Oh, she got thrown from her carriage and hurt. Oh, she had a concussion. Yes, she had a concussion, and she's still unconscious. That's not good. If you know anything about concussions, that's a big one. Next paragraph. Actually, let's see. He seemed to have contracted, and he had not at all his habitual ease of manner. Poor mother. And it's interesting because while Taya had him to herself, she could depend on him entirely to focus on her. And then she finds out that he's paying attention to his mother. At the bottom of page 339, our big German houses, our good German cooking, you might have got lost in the upholstery. That's funny. That substantial comfort might take the temper out of you, dull your edge. Yes, he said, I guess you were meant for the jolt of the breakers. So, as much as she might have wanted to marry him, he can see that perhaps might have dampened her enthusiasm, her dazzlingness, her overpowering strength. And that's probably true. I think I showed you at the beginning of this class a Victorian drawing room, and the curtains and the upholstered furniture and the rug were all in the same pattern. I'd get lost in that. When I moved into this house, somebody observed, I'm not sure who, one of my family members, that all of the walls are painted the same color, and I haven't yet decided what color I'm going to paint them, but they're all Band-Aid color, and I sometimes feel like I'm incognito when I'm up against them, because I'm Band-Aid color. That's beside the point. But anyway, he knows that she probably would have gotten absorbed into his family, and maybe it would have squashed her a little bit. On the next page, let's see. He says that she's fussy about money, and Taya sat down in a chair. It's only poor people who feel that way about money and who are really honest. And then she says she admits that she had taken a sachet from a department store in Chicago. Probably Marshall Fields, wouldn't you think? So she stole a sachet and felt bad about it. It was a little blue silk bag of orris root powder. I wasn't sure what that it was, but it has a very sweet and very floral smell. And then, let's see, on the top of page 341, he picked up a bunch of violets and smelled them. You're leaving me like this. Well, it's almost inhuman to be able to do it so kindly and unconditionally. So she's forsaking him. But what else can she do? She can't do anything else. Next paragraph, but all the same, I cared a great deal more than anybody else did. I lived through it. I'll have to live through this. And he picks up remember the score of the opera that Wunsch gave her? He picks that up. And I have a note about the wording in German here. What's that? Oh, this is a soon, O wonder, upon my tomb will blossom a flower from the ashes of my heart. The lines are from Adelaide, a poem by Frederick von Mithissen, set to music by Beethoven. All right. Next page, about 2/3 of the way down. She says something, and he says, "Why have you gone back to the vernacular of moonstone?" She says, "It's perfectly good moonstone, my dear, like the ready-made clothes that hang in the window, made to fit everybody and fit nobody." That's probably true. Have you ever bought a pair of pants from Amazon? You can't do it. You have to try on 50 pairs and you have to go somewhere to get them. You'll be with the right sort of people, and you'll get a new speech full of shades and color like your voice, alive like your mind. It will be almost like being born again. Yes. Down at the bottom of this page, Taya gave a deep sigh. I wish one could look ahead and see what's coming to one. And he says that would never do. It's the uncertainty that makes us try. I like that line. It's true. If we knew what was going to happen next, And if we didn't like it, we'd avoid it. So then there would be no, there's a saying that if you roll the dice, you can't roll, you can't win a 6 if you never roll the dice. I think that's what he's trying to suggest to her. At the bottom of page 343, Fred looked at his watch and rose. He drew her gently toward the door with him. Get all you can. Be generous to yourself. I can't help feeling that you'll gain somehow by my losing so much, that you'll gain the very thing I lose. And, therein lies the conundrum. He has to lose her in order for her to gain what she needs to gain in order to be the artist. The top of next page, it's in the big paragraph. After all, she was a Moonstone girl, one of the preacher's children. Everything else was in Fred's imagination. Why was she called upon to take such chances? Any safe, humdrum work that did not compromise her would be better. But if she failed now, she would lose her soul. Yes. At the bottom of page 344, she's dreaming. In one dream she was looking into a hand glass and thinking that she was getting better looking, when the glass began to grow smaller and smaller, and her own reflection to shrink, until she realized that she was looking into Ray Kennedy's eyes, seeing her face in that look of his which she could never forget. She's dreaming of Moonstone. She can look back on it. She can even see herself as part of Moonstone. But what Ray saw in her eyes is still there. Remember that he would see the sparkle in her eye? The last sentence of this chapter. After all, it was not too late. She was only 20 years old, and the boat sailed at noon. There was still time. She was only 20. Holy smokes. We go into the next chapter entitled Kronberg. I just have to find my notes here. Oh, yeah. So now we are back in Denver. Howard Archie is standing at the window of his private room in the offices of the San Felipe Mining Company. He's become quite successful. He's 10 years older than when we saw him last, and emphatically 10 years more prosperous. A decade of coming into things has not so much aged him as it has fortified, smoothed, and assured him. He's got massive shoulders that carry 50 years and the control of his great mining interests more lightly than they carried 40 years and a country practice. So it seems like he has abandoned his practice. And down at the bottom, there's a reference to Governor Alden. This Governor Alden, is patterned after some of the political arguing that was going on at the time. This character is fictitious, but the political disturbances discussed in this chapter are not fictional. So then we go on. There's a description of old Jasper Flight, who is a prospector. He also is a fictional character. He's asking for Dr. Archie to grubstake him again. And to grubstake is to buy his provisions, food, tent, and that kind of thing. And then Dr. Archie would get a cut of whatever the prospector found. And Cather certainly wants us to picture this prospector riding around on a burro. I just can see that in my head. Of all the crazy prospectors I've ever known, he's the most interesting because he's really crazy. That's what Archie is. He's in this conversation with the clerk. So in walks Ottenberg on page 351. Let's see. Under the general keying up of the attitude, manners take on a heartiness, a vivacity that is one expression of the half-unconscious excitement which Colorado people miss when they drop into the lower strata of air. Um, I think that's probably true. I used to ski at Breckenridge. I haven't skied at Breckenridge in a long time, but it seems as if when you come down off of the mountain where the air is better, or it's not quite so high, and where you can breathe better, there's a different attitude than there is amongst the people who live up in that strata. Let's see. Look in the middle of the next page, page 352. There's an interesting description. Let's see. This whole paragraph is imbued with color. The afternoon at 5 o'clock, Dr. Archie emerged from the State House after his talk with Governor Alden and crossed the terrace under a saffron sky. The snow, beaten hard, was blue in the dusk. A day of blinding sunlight had not even started a thaw. The lights of the city twinkled pale below him in the quivering violet light. Notice all the colored language. The dome of the State House behind him was still red with the light from the west. Before he got into his car, the doctor paused to look about him at the scene of which he never tired. And then the next paragraph, Archie had never known what comfort was until he became a widower. There's where the missus went. Though with characteristic delicacy or dishonesty, he insisted upon accrediting his peace of mind to the San Felipe, to time, to anything but his release from Mrs. Archie. Remember her? She would take his cream and water it down before she let him have any of it, and she shut up the house in order to prevent it from getting dusty. She was very stingy, remember? The poor woman's fight against dust was her undoing at last. One summer day when she was rubbing the parlor upholstery with gasoline. Kaboom! There was an explosion. And she must have inhaled the burning gas and died almost instantly. Poor Mrs. Archie, I mean, she wasn't a very likable person, but that's a pretty awful way to go. Let's see, the townspeople said they added that nothing but a powerful explosion could have killed Mrs. Archie, and that it was only right the doctor should have a chance. Everybody liked him, and nobody liked her. Archie's past was literally destroyed when his wife died. And then a few lines later, oh yeah, because his house burns to the ground. All those material reminders which have such power over people disappeared in an hour. I totally understand that. When I moved from my other house in Mequon to this house, I had gotten to the point where I could no longer purge anything. And this house is a good deal smaller than my other one. And it all came with me. And we piled it up in the garage. I'm still sorting through it. You bring it all with, no matter what. In a few years, Dr. Archie was a very rich man. He was politically influential. It says his political influence was considerable. He had thrown it all 2 years ago to the new reform platform and had brought about the election of a governor whose conduct he was now heartily ashamed. That's this Governor Alden. And we'll get some insight into him in a bit. So now the doctor has a staff of 3 Japanese boys, and Fred picks up. I just underlined this because I didn't know what it was. Fred turned from the fine specimen of a peccary he had been examining and said, "A man is an owl to live in such a place alone, Archie. Why don't you marry? A peccary, that's how you say it, is a small South American pig-like creature." So maybe he's been traveling. We're not sure yet. You know more than I, Archie spoke politely. I'm not very wide awake about women. So Yeah, I remember the story about him getting married to Belle. I think that was her name. She was pretty and vivacious until they actually married, and then she just kind of withered away. Um, at the top of page 355, there is a reference to the Anti-Saloon League and Vice Commission amount to. How could you fall for a mousetrap like Pink Alden, Archie? So he did, though. Dr. Archie laughed as he began to carve. He's gone his limit. People won't read about his blameless life anymore. I knew those interviews he gave would cook him. And they're going on about the Colorado politics. And let's see. In case you weren't sure, there is a reference. Archie says to one of his Japanese boys, bring up some cognac and arak tea. I didn't know what that was either, so I underlined it. It's fermented coconut, or fermented coconut milk, and it fermented, so it's a liqueur. Page 355, at the bottom of, about a third of the way from the bottom. He says, too much light in here, isn't there, Fred? Light the lamp there on my desk tie. He turned off the electric glare and settled himself deep into the chair opposite Ottenberg's. So Cather is trying to leave a trail of the things that Archie has been able to acquire because of his wealth, and one of them is electric lights. But it's pretty bright. I guess they didn't have dimmers at the time. Probably not. Turn the page to 356. You say, why don't I? The doctor spoke with deliberation. But on the other hand, why should I? He puffed away and seemed through his half-closed eyes to look down several long roads with the intention of luxuriously rejecting all of them and remaining where he was. The point is that that Ottenberg has suggested that Archie get into politics. End of the paragraph. Nothing in it that I particularly want. And a man's not effective in politics unless he wants something for himself and wants it hard. So that's probably true. He says, just now I'm thinking of running on to New York for a few weeks. And he asks him, are you going to see Taya? And he says, in fact, I suspect I'm going exactly to see her. The top of page 357. Of course, the doctor apologized. I want to hear her, but I'm afraid it would be rather wasted on me. I'm no judge of music. Never mind that, the younger man pulled himself up in his chair. She gets it across to people who aren't judges. That's just what she does. And that was an interesting way of putting it, because she clearly puts her heart into the music. Remember that Fred used to be able to read her emotion by looking at her back. It's her body posture that is indicative of the feeling she's putting into the music. Down at the bottom, page 357, he stopped and smiled. Miss Kronberg, you mean? Yes, very. She seems to sing for the idea. And all along in here, we see that Cather is trying to define art. And it, in part, is her own experience, Cather's own experience with art. Though for Cather, it's words, whereas for Taya, it's the notes. But to Cather, this is the same process. There's a quick little reference to Mrs. Fred. Your wife is still the same, says the doctor. Absolutely. Hasn't been out of the sanitarium for 7 years now. No possibility of her ever getting better. Meanwhile, I'm tied hand and foot. What does society get out of such a state of things, I'd like to know, except a tangle of irregularities? So the Mrs., if you recall, seemed a little bit left of center, so to speak, and we now find that she's been committed. Next paragraph. The whole question, and this is interesting in light of what we have seen for women, The whole question of a young man's marrying has looked pretty grave to me for a long while. How have they the courage to keep on doing it? For some time the doctor watched his guest, who was sunk in bitter reflections. Such things used to be better than they do now, I believe. Seems to me all the married people I knew when I was a boy were happy enough. He paused again and bit the end of a fresh cigar. You never saw Taya's mother, did you, Ottenberg? That's a pity. Mrs. Kronberg was a fine woman. I always felt that Taya made a mistake not coming home when Mrs. Kronberg was ill, no matter what it cost her. So we know that Mrs. Kronberg is now in the past tense, and that Taya didn't go home to see her before she died. And we think that makes her heartless. But really, the definition in Cather's mind of art is that one must, if one is going to be an artist, one must forsake all. We've seen her give up Fred, and we've seen now that she has even forsaken her mother. Over on page 359, yes, Taya and I have had a good deal of bother about Tor. Remember Tor, the little guy? Well, he's grown up, and here he is, the chauffeur. Tor was born a chauffeur before there were cars to drive. Now there's cars. Electric lights. We're getting all the accoutrements of the progress at the end of the 1800s. He was never good for anything else. Lay around home and collected postage stamps and took bicycles to pieces, waiting for the automobile to be invented. So he never went much of anywhere, didn't have a whole lot of wherewithal. He certainly didn't have the drive and intellect or artistry is a better word, that Taya has. The bottom of page 359. At 30, indeed, as we have seen, Archie was a soft-hearted boy under a manly exterior, still whistling to keep up his courage. Prosperity and large responsibilities, above all, getting free of poor Mrs. Archie had brought out a good deal more than he knew was in him. So he was oppressed, and we have seen other situations where the oppression kills the spirit. So it's parallel to what Taya has to endure. She has to forsake everything for the sake of art. At the end of the paragraph on page 360, what was it that he had expected and missed? Why was he, more than he was anything else, disappointed? And in the middle of the next paragraph, there had been something stirring about those years in Moonstone, when he was a restless young man on the verge of breaking into larger enterprises. It's an interesting retrospect from the narrator. And when she was a restless child on the verge of growing up into something unknown. They were both on the verge, and they were friends. He realized now that she had counted for a great deal more to him than he knew at the time. It was a continuous sort of relationship. A few lines later, he had never asked himself then if it was strange that he should find a child of 12 the most interesting and companionable person in Moonstone. Other people thought her relationship to these various people was a little odd, but she was a little odd. At the top of page 361. But wherever his life had touched Taya Kronberg's, there was still a little warmth left, a little sparkle. There's a nice image in the next sentence. Their friendship seemed to run over those disconnected years like a leafy pattern, still bright and fresh when the other patterns had faded into dull background. Isn't that nice? Their walks and drives and confidences, the night they watched the rabbit in the moonlight. Why were those things stirring to remember? Whenever he thought of them, they were distinctly different from other memories of his life. Always seemed humorous, gay, with a little thrill of anticipation and mystery about them. Next few lines later, it came over him now that the unexpected favors of fortune, no matter how dazzling, that means his wealth, do not mean very much to us. They may excite or divert us for a time, but when we look back, the only things we cherish are those which in some way met our original want, the desire which formed in us in early youth, undirected and of its own accord. That's one of those paragraphs that deserves a star, because it isn't really Cather moralizing, but it's more a window into Dr. Archie's and Taya's friendship. It's a little bit like the image of the pigeons and their pink feet. I was really taken with that because of my bird palace, and the pigeons that sit in there, I can probably see them. They're probably in there right now. But their little pink feet, just thought that was so interesting. For the first 4 years after Taya went to Germany, things went as usual with the Kronberg family. So we're going to look back at the Kronbergs. We're not going to completely leave them behind. But then Mr. Kronberg, who had never been ill, died suddenly of cancer of the liver, and after his death, Mrs. Kronberg went, as her neighbor said, into decline. They're just going to wither away on page 362. When the doctor arrived, she was sitting up in her bed. So when Dr. Archie, and this is back in Moonstone, before Dr. Archie gave up his practice to become a miner or a financier, but he soon gathered that she had made no determination to get well. She told him, indeed, that she could not very well get along without Mr. Kronberg. That's really sad, isn't it? And then in the next paragraph, the doctor watched her wonderingly as she went on knitting, thinking how much she looked like Taya. But there's a difference. Remember that Mrs. had insight into Taya's nature. The difference was one of degree rather than of kind, so they look a lot like each other. The daughter had a compelling enthusiasm. The mother had none. And which is, of course, why Mrs. Kronberg can't live without Mr. Kronberg. If we look over on page 363, let's see. It was not that this is about Taya not coming home to see her mother before her mother passes on. She was going to get her debut in Elizabeth. I have a note on that somewhere. I think that's a Wagner. This is a Wagner opera, and she had to stay or lose everything. The next few months would put her 5 years ahead, or would put her back so far that it would be of no use to struggle further. And so she decides not to go home. But you can comprehend this to a degree, because for her you didn't just get on an airplane and get there and then come back to do your part. She has struggled this far. She has journeyed from Moonstone to Chicago. Then she went to Mexico. From there they went to New York. And now she's in Germany. This journey of hers towards artistry is continuing. And she knows she can't get off that train, that journey. At the bottom of page 363, we're back with Mrs. Kronberg. Bringing up a family is not all it's cracked up to be, said Mrs. Kronberg with a flicker of irony as she tucked the letter back under her pillow. Isn't that interesting? The children you don't especially need, you have always with you, like the poor. But the bright ones get away from you. They have their own way to make in the world. Seems like the brighter they are, the further they go. And we see then that Mrs. Kronberg always did have insight into her children, but she's willing to let them go. Um, there's some words in German in the next paragraph. Oh, yes, Elizabeth is a Wagner, the heroine of Wagner's early works. These words are, "Dear Hall, I greet thee again," sung by Elizabeth as she makes her first stage appearance in the Hall of Song. Um, let's see. Go down 2 paragraphs. When he finished, she said thoughtfully, "I'd counted on hearing her sing again, but I always took my pleasures as they came." Remember that all the way through we have seen Mrs. Kronberg voice a kind of fatalism. What will be, will be. Whereas Taya continues to throw the dice in an attempt to hit the 6. I guess I got about as much out of Taya's voice as anybody will ever get. And then at the top of page 365, after they had recalled many pleasant memories together, Mrs. Kronberg said suddenly, "I always understood about her going off without coming to see us that time." So remember that really uncomfortable trip from Chicago back to Moonstone where she had become other? She no longer seemed to be one of the family. Mrs. understood that. "Oh, I know, you have to keep your own counsel. You were a good friend to her. I never forgot that." She patted the doctor's sleeve and went on absently. "There was something she didn't want to tell me, and that's why she didn't come. Something happened when she was with those people in Mexico." Yeah. She learned the song, the music. Next paragraph. She isn't Mrs. wait. She doesn't look like she was beholden to anyone, does she? She isn't Mrs. Kronberg. She never has been. That was why she borrowed the money from me. Oh, I knew she'd never have sent for you if she hadn't done anything if she had done anything to shame us. She's always proud. It's like a refrain all the way through Moonstone. What will the neighbors say? And so Mrs. knows that she would never do anything like be kept by Fred, which would be embarrassing. But then the Mrs. Kohler left her the peace picture of the burning of Mexico. And remember how this image works, that the peace picture is almost emblematic of the little bits that Taya is putting together to create her artistic self. So that the little bits by themselves don't mean anything independently. But when they are put together like the peace picture, they create a picture of something. Let's see. Whoops. At the bottom of the previous page, 365, her tone fairly startled the doctor. It was so vibrating with a fierce, defiant kind of pride he had heard often in Taya's voice. And that's Mrs. Mrs. has the same kind of sparkle, we think. Not to the degree, which is what the narrator has told us. He looked down wonderingly at his old friend and patient. After all, one never knew people to the core. That's really part of the point. Dr. Archie doesn't really know Taya to the core because she didn't reveal everything. And when Fred said 20 pages ago that she never was truthful to Dr. Archie, this is what he meant. So you have to star that. After all, one never knew people to the core. And she didn't let out the core because she probably couldn't define it as a child, but she knew it was there. The next time Dr. Archie came to Moonstone, he came to be a pallbearer at Mrs. Kronberg's funeral. When he last looked at her, she was so serene and queenly that he went back to Denver feeling almost as if he had helped to bury Taya Kronberg herself. The handsome head in the coffin seemed to him much more really Taya than did the radiant young woman in the picture, looking about at the Gothic vaultings and greeting the Hall of Song. So, what he sees in Mrs. Kronberg is the nugget, the core of Taya. And he thinks to himself that Taya isn't really the costumed and fluffed up personage on the stage. It's her voice, her artistry, and it came from, or at least was inherited from, Mrs. Kronberg, who cultivated it. So this was the limit of what I told you to read for today, page 366. Because I went on and on and on last week, in an effort to catch up, because I was afraid we weren't going to catch up, I got pretty far ahead, and so we are going to reconvene again next week, and we will finish the book. So you have, last week will be the last week for all of the lectures. I have some bits of information to convey to you about the novel overall. And that is what I have for you today. If you have questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, of course, this is St. Patrick's Day is this week, hence my Ireland shirt. I had planned to get all dressed up like Aunt Esther's pet horse with all my green finery. But when you're speaking to a camera, all you get is the sweatshirt. Anyway, have a nice week. We'll finish the book on Monday, and that is all.